So before we go into our topic of the day on ethics, I just wanted to quickly go over this um, article on reading a research article um, after our library session, since in library session, you all started to look at potential resources and sources for your projects. Okay, so the basics about articles are that they have a standardized format, that there are major sections to them, and that each section has a specific purpose. The heading contains the title, a brief description, which is a brief description of what the article is about, so the title should give you some idea of what it's about. Sometimes it can also carry the main point. It also usually says something about the scholarly area of interest so that people can easily find it. So if you're interested in ADHD, or if you're interested in identity development or literacy, those general topics are areas that are broad enough that if that's what the article is about, people are going to include them in the title because they want to draw that attention. The heading also contains the names of the authors and their affiliation, whether they're with a university or research institute. The abstract comes next, and that is a short preview of the article that tells you the topic. It usually has either the research question or the hypotheses. It tells you what methods were used and what conclusions were reached. So the abstract is a synopsis of an article. It should never be used instead of reading an article. Like, it shouldn't be used as a substitute for reading a full article, because the abstract can only give you a glimpse or just a little bit of insight into what's in it, so you really want to read the full thing. But let's take a look at this abstract and see where each of the components of the abstract of an abstract are. So the first thing was a statement of the research question. So here it tells us that this study examined the likelihood of viewing television programs and of viewing theatrical movies with general and content-specific advisories. So then the research questions are likely related to that. Like, so what is the likelihood of viewing television programs and viewing theatrical movies, right? So what is the likelihood? That's what the person was investigating, so they tell you this is what it was about in their abstract. So your abstract should contain something about that. You don't have to actually state the research questions of this article were, right? You can give a description of what you were examining, and that gives the person a sense of what the questions were. Then the statement of the methods used. So this just gives people an overview of what kind of study that it was. 63 undergraduate women, 122 undergraduate men. So it's really brief in this abstract. Some abstracts will say, we conducted interviews with this many men or this many women, or we observed 42 children, or whatever the case may be. That would also just be a brief statement of what actually was, what kind of methods were used, and then what conclusions were reached. So typically in an abstract, you want to get a brief summary of what the findings were. So the results show that among the 63 undergraduate men, viewing likelihood was increased significantly with the provision of all types of mature content advisories, whereas among the 122 undergraduate women, viewing interest increased with the sexuality advisory, but decreased with the violence advisory. In other words, undergraduate men, if there was a sexuality advisory or a violence advisory before a movie started, like, you know how when you first, like, say you're watching something on HBO and it says, like, this movie contains, violence or sexual explicit material, whatever. So the men were more likely to be more interested in watching if it was sexuality or violence, whereas for the women it was only sexuality but not violence. That's the finding of the study. Okay, so in an introduction to an article, so that's the abstract. Then comes the introduction, and here's where usually people put their lit review, context for the study, review of past literature, what do we know, what do we not know, why the study, what are the conceptual issues, and these things don't have to be in this order, okay? These items are not listed in a specific order. You typically wouldn't open an article with what the literature, what the past literature has found, but these are the components of an introduction. And some people do begin with giving a summary or a history of what research has shown about something for a long time. The introduction should also give you a sense of the questions that this study examines, and also have a statement of hypotheses or expected results. I would also add, like, your research question would go at the end of the introduction, typically at the end of the introduction, not always. So I have written and I have read articles where the research question gets asked almost like at the end of, like, the kind of the first paragraph that draws the reader in. It's like, so what will we do about this issue, kind of, or what is the answer? What are the best options for blah, blah, blah? This article will investigate. So you can ask that question there. It doesn't have to necessarily come at the end, but typically, right, like, standard kind of run-of-the-mill is that it'll come at the end of your introduction section, and that your lit review will be in the introduction. Some people do a separate lit review. Some people do an introduction that contains a statement of the problem, a compelling reason for why we should do this study and why it's important and why no one else has looked at it, and then say a separate lit review section that says, here's what people have found in the past, and here's the things that we still don't know. Okay, so it varies. The method section is where you're going to tell people, your readers, what you did and how you did it, or what, in the case of reading a research article, it's where the authors are telling you what they did and how they did it. So they describe the participants in the study, they tell you how many people, they usually tell you demographic characteristics of those people, they tell you how the participants were obtained, which is known as sampling techniques. So were people recruited randomly, or was it targeted to a specific population so that you were interested only in third graders, for instance? And then what were the procedures, what was done? Again, was it interviews, was it observations, was it surveys, were they online surveys? Did you, do both interviews and questionnaires and give kids, for example, like a screening test or some kind of test of aptitude or a language test or whatever? And then what are the variables? So what are the different pieces that are at play, that are being considered? So this is what would be included in the method section. Then we come to the results section, which of course gives you the findings of the study. What were the findings? There are lots of different ways of presenting findings. Mostly quantitative studies will have tables and graphs that show frequencies, or they show statistical results of what they found. Sometimes they'll include a graph or a chart if it's going to show like a proportion, if they want to show a pie chart. But qualitative studies often use tables and graphs as well, because it's really just about like an easy way to present data. So I've used tables in qualitative articles just to show like how certain quotes illustrate certain themes. So if I'll have like a column for the themes, for each of the themes, and then I'll show like different quotes. And it's just easier to take that in a table form than it is necessarily in paragraph form. But obviously words are also, in a way that people present findings of the study. So depending on what kind of study you're looking at, you'll see those kinds of things, and you'll notice those kinds of things. The discussion section is a brief review of major findings. So this is where you're sort of telling the reader, or the authors are telling you as the reader, here are the things that I want you to take away from this. So, there are lots of different things that we found, and some of them are interesting, and some of them are maybe less interesting, but when you sort of end this article, what I want you to remember is these important findings. So here are the major findings. A discussion of whether the findings support the hypotheses or expectations, and reasons for any discrepancies. So, as expected, we found this, or contrary to our expectations, we found this. And then the author would say, or authors would say, here's why we think we did find this, or here's why we were thinking that we may not find it. How these findings fit into an existing body of knowledge. Something that's really important as a useful concept that I learned early on that is a nice way to think about research, is that research is a conversation. And the reason why we write articles and chapters and things is because we're conversing with each other in a field. So in a field of study or in an area of inquiry, we are saying, I found this. Oh, interesting. I found that. Oh, well, I did another study similar to these two, and my findings were slightly different, and I think it's because my framework is really different. I think these people, their theory is not really very strong. I'd like to offer a new perspective. So it's a conversation, and that's why you want to relate in your discussion, or the discussion wants to relate. How does this study contribute to the conversation around, kids and ADHD and TV use? That's a research conversation. And so what do we know about that now that I've done this study? They should also, the discussion can also contain an interpretation of what the findings mean, because sometimes it may not be clear exactly, like findings can be interpreted in different ways. And so then the authors in the discussion section have an opportunity to tell you how they want you to interpret their findings, because they're the ones who really know the data well. So they can tell you that, while it may seem that these data suggest this and that, it's this other thing, because they're the ones who really know the data well, and they can tell you it's not exactly what you think, it's this other thing. And then often a connection between the results and broader conceptual issues. So in the same way that there's this conversation going on with other research, there's also a conversation going on with theory or conceptual issues, and how does a study perhaps contribute to that conversation? And then the conclusion is usually just restating of the major points, and shouldn't have anything new. It should just sort of seal the deal, end it, put a nice bow on it. And then you have your references cited or references section, bibliography. It's a full bibliographic reference for everything cited in the article. You want to make sure that it's accurate and that it's complete, that it follows a particular format. We talked about, in the syllabus I said, people can use MLA, depending on what the convention is in your field, in your area, in your concentration. APA is the most commonly used in education, but a lot of people in education also use Chicago style, they use the ASA style, they use MLA. It depends. Like historians will always use MLA. And some people who are doing linguistics, because they publish in linguistics journals, will do MLA, but then American Psych Association is sort of one that's like super, super common. And this was from last week, so I'll bring in some things about APA today. So the reason why it's important to know how to read a research article is not only because it will help you when you're reading it to make sense of it and to know how to understand the different components of it. It's also because when you write your thesis, your final product is going to be kind of a long version of all of this, and it's going to have all these sections. So this is an important tool, because you can look at all of the sections of your writing and say, have I done this? Have I told people what I'm wondering about? Have I told people what the previous research have found? Have I told people what I did and how I did it? So you can really use this as a tool to help you check the quality of your own report and your own final project. Does anybody have any questions about that? Mm-hmm.
So, I'm just trying to think about when I looked at research articles, will all of them have these all completely divided and separated out?
No.
Because sometimes I feel like results and discussion sometimes go together, or...
Yeah. I've put results and discussion together in articles that I've published.
Okay.
Because it just makes more sense. A lot of qualitative studies will do that, just because it's really hard. Like if you're doing a quantitative study and the results are just like, here's a table and here are the stats that we ran and here's what we found, and then like, now let me tell you about them, which is the discussion. In qualitative, it's harder because it's words, so it's harder to separate that process of here's what people said and here's what it means and here's how you should interpret it. So often those are combined. So like intro and lit review, sometimes they can be separate, sometimes they're together. Discussion and conclusion, or discussion and results, sometimes can be together, sometimes can be separate. But methods stand alone. So it's like lit review, intro, a little bit of something, methods stand alone, and then results and discussion sometimes together conclusion. That makes sense. How did you all do after the session with Scott, looking for articles?
It's a lot easier.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Good. I'm glad that helped because I know you were having a lot of trouble. Yeah. Good. Anyone else?
I know that he had mentioned that, like, you know, there was the competition with Eric, and that some of them were coming back mid-October. And I actually went and did some more research, and some of the articles that I wasn't able to access before, they were starting to become available. So
Oh, good. Good.
That was really nice.
Yeah, that's encouraging. That's
Yeah.
encouraging. So maybe they really will, by the middle of October, have everything.
Yeah. Or at least slowly getting there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And there may be a way to find those articles physically, too. So, you know, also don't forget that the library subscribes to thousands of journals. Obviously, it can't subscribe to as many as it can access electronically, but there are plenty of, like, if you just go to the periodicals room, you can look up the citation, and then each of them are filed or are organized in the current issues are in the periodicals room, but the past issues are in the stacks. So you can go to the stacks and look through old issues and photocopy, which is what I always had to do in school. It's like a recent thing to be able to download stuff and not have to go to the library. It's weird. Okay. So, I also wanted to just go over APA, only because it's the most commonly used style. So I'm not going to go over it in a whole lot of depth, but I'm actually going to do this handout, which is going to be related to our conversation on ethics, and it's about removing bias in language. APA has really explicit guidelines on how to write, how to use language in a way that isn't offensive and in a way that is empowering and not disempowering for people. So I thought that would be useful. Now, just from what you all know of your areas of your fields, do you know what the citation, like the preferred citation is?
English, it's usually MLA, but they do use AP.
Yeah. You're not an English ed though, are you?
Oh, no. It's just my double major.
Oh, double major. Okay. Is anybody going to be using anything aside from APA for their citations that you know of?
I usually use MLA.
Usually use MLA.
I can switch.
You don't have to. And the other really wonderful thing about RefWorks is that you can use RefWorks, which is why I'm not going to go over it extensively. RefWorks will format for you. Now, you have to still know your style well, because RefWorks, and I use something called EndNote, they are not perfect. So, for instance, in APA style, the title of an article is supposed to be in lowercase. The first letter of it is capitalized, and then the rest of it is lowercase, unless you have a colon, and then the next letter after that is capitalized. That's not the case in all the styles, but EndNote can't change the case. So however you enter it in EndNote is the way that it's going to put it out. But if you happen to be using a style that requires you to capitalize every letter, you have to go back through and make those kinds of corrections. So definitely know what is proper, like what's appropriate. But it's very helpful. I'm going to show you all a very, very useful resource. So the Purdue University Online Writing Lab is one of the oldest, actually like one of the first online resources that is so fantastically helpful and contains so much information. They have an APA guide. They tell you like the general guidelines, all the different things and how it's supposed to go. You can look here on the left and see the formatting stuff and how do you do in-text citations and how do you do footnotes and all that stuff. So it's really fantastic. They have the same thing. Would you maybe point the camera just a little bit? Let's just rotate it just slightly so they can see the screen.
The screen?
Yeah, just a little. And then you can turn it back. So this is the, can you see the top? the
Mhm.
Purdue Online Writing Lab. So you can Google that and it'll come right up. And they also have an MLA one.
I use the
Um,
MLA one all the time for Purdue. They
Yeah.
have answers to everything.
It's a really fabulous resource. So I just highly encourage everyone, even if you are going to use RefWorks or some other reference writing software, that you also just in your own head have a sense of what it's supposed to look like, so you can make sure that it's not incorrect, because that does matter. It's important. Okay. So, we are talking today really about, in depth about ethics and how do you make sure that you're doing ethically sound research. Related to that, I think, and so just sort of like a tie-in to this conversation is how to talk about people and how to refer to certain groups. So this guide, even though it's for APA, it's pretty relevant. I mean, it doesn't matter whether you're writing in MLA or whether you're writing in Chicago style. Like, you still should follow these guidelines because the guidelines are really about respecting people. So they have, for instance, using the term non-disabled or persons without disability in terms of instead of normal, right? Like, kind of easy mistakes or things that easily pop up in language when we're talking, but that in writing we should really avoid and make sure that we're not using. So, like, you should use non-handicapping language. For instance, a disabled person is not as preferable as a person with disabilities or a person with a disability, because then the person is not defined, right? Or like poor children or children living in poverty, because then it sort of humanizes. Like, what comes first is who you are, and then whatever whatever adjectives may be associated or relevant. But it's important to remember that. Okay, so here are some. They show you like problematic terms versus preferred terms. Very, very helpful. Also for avoiding heterosexual bias in language. And further in, for avoiding racial or ethnic bias in language. So these guidelines can be applied, like, these are three major areas and typically three major populations that people will write about, but it applies for all kinds of, like, you just want to be respectful in language no matter what, whatever group you're referring to. So this just is a really helpful guide in this. So I would encourage that you take a look through that. It's not like a reading assignment per se. It's not like you have to give it like all your attention, but just peruse it, especially the do's and the don'ts if you're not sure, if you're writing an article about a population and you're not sure whether you're using the right language. It's just helpful to have. Okay, so now let's turn more fully to our conversation about ethics. So you all read these pieces on Fisher, by Fisher and by Mew and Bell. So, who remembers why protection for human subjects, like why the need for it arose? How did it start?
It arose from the Nazi medical strike.
Can you say just a little more in like?
And like what?
Mm-hmm.
And like what? My own words?
Just yeah. Mm-hmm.
So, this is how I understand it. And
Yeah.
It can be wrong, but because the harsh treatment over there, they were kind of dehumanizing everybody. They want to kind of change that and make everybody realize, like, yeah, you might not know this person, but they are still a person. They have all the same things that you have, and you shouldn't do something to them that would kind of make them seem less of a person than you are.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, that's how I understood it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It's about not harming people. Yeah. Yeah. What else did people get out of it? Of like the history of it?
I'm taking teaching special ed too, so something that we talked about that came up in this article was Bill Willowbrook. book,
York,
right?
yeah.
In upstate New York, it was like this facility for people with disabilities and handicaps, and they mistreated them, and they gave them not vaccines for polio, but like test vaccines for polio, and they were treated really badly. And I think I don't know, I'm not sure who the president at the time was, but I think like the president went to visit the place before they shut it down. So I think that was like a huge. It got a lot of publicity. So I think that brought up the issue for people mainstream.
It also talks about the maximization of possible benefits and minimization of possible harms. So it's like if you can do it in a way that won't harm them, but can still bring the same benefit, you should try to do it in that way instead of a way that can potentially harm them.
So what are the main principles of ethics in research?
In the Fisher article, it talked about beneficence, respect, and justice.
Beneficence,
But-
which is a hard word to say.
Informed consent is like the first part. And then like everything that goes with informed consent, which is like making sure that the language is appropriate and for like an adult and a child. And that they understand like the procedures and all the specifics about this area.
And there was the idea of adolescence and whether or not they're able to make their own decisions.
And the article also talks about how it's especially like important when you're working with youth and adolescents and children because that's a time where they're building their identity and whatever you're doing can affect that and being mindful of like how the results or your experience can affect them positively and negatively and what that like what those effects also say about the results of your experiment as well as like the child's understanding and effect of the consent.
Also, like presenting the results in a way that parents don't think that you're recommending something or implying anything about their child, but just like presenting the facts, the results.
What about this issue of balancing recruitment and protection in the Mew and Bell article? So what are some of the things that you remember from, and like what sort of things jumped out at you? What was interesting about this idea of balancing recruitment and protection? Why does that matter?
Well, one of the specifics that I remember is that especially if you're working in areas or with people who come from poverty, then you have to, some monetary compensation might be appropriate, but you have to be careful not to make it too much, that it would it would be coercion basically because, they would give up whatever morals they had or whatever they had against doing it in order just to get money.
Yeah. So who gets to decide all this stuff? Who gets to decide, for instance, just piggybacking on Allah's example, who gets to decide whether you say that you want to pay participants $10 for every questionnaire? Who decides whether $2 is coercive or whether it's appropriate? Do you know who makes those decisions?
with the IRB board.
So the IRB is the Institutional Review Board, and most organizations have them. Universities, certainly, every university, every college has one. A lot of organizations that are not universities, but where, like hospitals or facilities where there might be potential participants, have them because they have to protect those people. Churches don't usually have them, but if you wanted to do research, say, at a church or at some other kind of religious organization, you would probably still have to run your stuff by someone, and probably a group of people would probably have to make the decision. But formal institutional review boards are part of most major organizations in order to ensure that the research that's done is ethical and that it is protecting human subjects. Now, so remember the history about the Nazi experiments and so on, and then you remember the syphilis stuff in the Tuskegee men. The medical community, in the medical world, is where a lot of the policies and stuff originated for ethical conduct and research and informed consent and so on. So a lot of the stuff that people talk about, like in terms of treatments, right? Is everybody going to receive the same treatment? What are the benefits of treatment, or the potential negatives and so on? That really refers to drug testing, to testing of medical procedures and medical things. It's newer to social science, even though it's really important in social science. It's newer to social science, and social science presents some interesting sort of quandaries, or it's making it not so straightforward. Like, it's a little bit easier to be straightforward when it comes to, should you inject someone with poison or not? Or should you should you give drugs to prisoners or not? Although none of it is easy, but in social science research, it's like, well, how do you define harm? If you're interviewing kids, say, who lost parents at 9/11, some aspect of it could be therapeutic, and yet some aspect of it could be harmful. So how do you make those kinds of decisions, and who gets to decide, well, this is crossing a certain line? Like, this all right here is okay, but then if you do this, then you've crossed that line. And so there are certain things that have been put into place, especially in light of social science research, for once you've done a study, what can you do after in order to ensure that even the participants who didn't, say, receive a drug or whatever, that they can still get certain benefits? Or in the case of, say, talking to kids about traumatic issues, that you would have a plan for, if a child seems traumatized, I'm going to refer them to this psychologist, and I have a relationship with the psychologist, and the psychologist has agreed that he or she is going to take all the cases. When I say this child is distressed, the person will do a screening and see what's going on and potentially see the child. So these are the things that have been put into place. Let me just close the door a little bit. So thinking about all of these issues, right, all the stuff that you've read and the different things that you know, what kinds of issues could you see coming up in educational research in terms of ethics?
Maybe like a study affecting the grade that a student receives, them being pulled out to do the study and like losing class time.
Yeah.
They also talk about passive consent, where when they send home like I guess an invitation to be part of the study, and the parent only has to respond if they don't want the kid to participate. And so if the parent doesn't see it, then the child is automatically participating, which could be tricky.
I actually have a question about that. Is that something that is approved for people to do, or is it just something that's contested in this kind of research?
Well, with most of this stuff, it would have to come down to the decision of the board, of the the institutional review board, whether they thought that it was warranted to have passive consent for this situation or not warranted.
Okay, so it's
and it's used. It's not that popular, but it's used, and it's usually used for things that are really sort of innocuous. So say, for instance, a researcher is studying space and is just interested in like classroom spaces and interested in sort of like what are the most beneficial ways of arranging a classroom. So they might want to go and observe multiple classrooms. They don't interact with the children. They don't observe the children. They don't make any assessments about the children. They don't observe the teacher. They are literally like, this many desks, very cool. That many desks, not so good. Lighting over here, great. Not those kinds of things. That an IRB would probably be like, yeah, sure. Like if the parents don't say no, then it's probably fine for the child to be in the room while this other person is there measuring, and because it's not really affecting anybody. So there are times when it's appropriate, and those times would probably be the times when there's just minimal interaction, or kind of interference with like what's happening day to day. But obviously, if there is personal information being collected, so another way that it might happen for passive consent is if they're not collecting like individual data, so they're not actually taking individual test scores of kids, or talking to kids individually, but maybe just looking somehow at the group level, like if maybe they're measuring noise levels, I don't know. Something that would be like a group thing that wouldn't involve needing to know anybody's names or even identifying them, giving them an ID. Because one of the ways that we protect confidentiality, which is one of the terms that you read about, is that we'll assign someone an ID so that Christine Jones becomes participant 105. And the only person who knows that Christine Jones is 105 is me and my research team, who have been trained in, all the IRB protection stuff, and they're not going to, tell anybody. And I'm also supposed to keep those things separate. So I'm supposed to have a separate file that says Christine Jones and her consent form that she signed that says, yes, I'm willing to be in the study. And I'm not supposed to put on that consent form, oh, and by the way, this is person 105. That's a separate thing. And then in a separate file, I have her, questionnaires and interviews and surveys that she took in a file 105. On my computer, I'm allowed to have a file that says, here are the participants and their real names, and here are their real ID numbers. But that's all supposed to be like on password protected computers and in locked offices. Like that language becomes really important to say, I am really trying to protect this person's confidentiality. It's not an anonymous thing, which is another option, where you could immediately assign people numbers and never include their names, and that's a whole lot easier to get approval for. But if you want to have their real names, which is fine, you can do that as long as you promise that you're going to protect confidentiality. So does everybody understand the difference between anonymity and confidentiality? Right? Anonymity, the identity is not known to anyone. Once the stuff has been collected, there's no way to link it back. Confidentiality, there is a way to link it back. You have to dig a little bit because you have to be good about protecting people, but it is possible to link an identity to like an actual person. What else? Any comments, questions, or? What about getting informed consent for kids? Is that possible?
Young children, or if the children are young, or if they have disabilities, like schizophrenia, I think that was an example. They might not be able to make correct decisions that's best for themselves. So it's better to get parents or guardians.
The Mox and Bell article also talked about the importance of child-friendly language, and how a lot of children don't really understand what it means to be confidential, or what confidentiality means, and what it means to stop a research in the middle, and also just framing the question and framing the framework of the research in terms of their language, so they really understand what they're going to be involved in, as opposed to just kind of asking them. And also, when you're researching with children, it's important to kind of make sure that they're not just saying yes because they know the adult, but that they're really understanding what they're involved in.
Also, said that one can present the information in a picture book or video format so that the kids can understand better.
NYU is now asking researchers, if you're going to be doing anything with children, to also have a consent form for children. You still need the parents' consent, but then they also want a separate child consent, not because the child is of legal age and able to, sort of sign off on things like that, but because they feel like it's important for kids to be informed, if not necessarily that their parents can say sure, and they can feel, they might not necessarily feel like, yeah, I really want to do this, but they should at least know what it is that they're doing, and they should know that they have a right to stop at any time.
Yeah, I mean, isn't it that, like, when you get permission from the parent, it's only permission to ask the child.
Right.
Not like permission to just go ahead with the research.
Well, the permission that you get from the parent may be like to look at the child's records or to interview the child, but the child has a right also, like once you start, if it's an observation or if it's an interview or something or a questionnaire, they have a right to at any point say, I don't want to do this anymore, or I'm not happy or I'm not comfortable. But I have to tell you, it's hard even when you tell kids that they can. Like I was doing research in Boston with high school and middle schoolers, and I had this one middle schooler who did the first interview with me, and it was fine. I had 3 different interviews. So first interview, no problem. Second interview, first tip was it took a long time to schedule. We would set a time, and I would come to her class, and I'd be like, okay, are you ready to come out? And she'd be like, actually, I can't right now because, so it would be like kind of, so she put me off a few times like that. And then finally one time she was like, yes, okay, it's fine. So then we went to this, this area that they had the school had said I could do interviews there as a private room. And so we go in there, and like her answers are more than short. You know what I mean? They're like beyond short. They're like, I'm like, so do you agree with this? And she's like, kind of, So probably about 5 questions in, I said, do you really want to do this? And she was like, and I was like, I don't really think that you're enjoying this. And if you're not having fun, and if you don't like this, we can stop. Do you want to stop? And she was like, yeah, I guess. It was even hard for her to like make it completely clear. But I think that's partly because, well, I mean, lots of different reasons, right? She doesn't want to hurt my feelings. She's been raised to be polite, and I'm an adult, and I'm not being mean to her. You know what I mean? So it's kind of like, she doesn't know exactly what's making her uncomfortable about it or why she doesn't really want to do it. So then it might have felt hard to say, I don't want to do this, because then like, well, why? I don't know. Because maybe it's lots of different reasons, right? And so I basically had to let her go and say, listen, it's okay, and I'm not going to be mad at you, and I'll see you tomorrow, and we can still, hang out. But it was really interesting to have that experience where she was sending like all her body language, like she was sending all the signals for no, but she couldn't bring herself to just say, I do not want to do this anymore. So that's something to be aware of, and particularly, kind of the younger kids are, although I think there's like a critical stage. There's going to be kids who are young enough, they're going to be like, nope, don't want to do it, and get away from me. I don't want to talk to you. And they will have no qualms, like the pre-Kers, like they're not going to have any trouble being like, and moving on. But there's like that middle childhood kind of period where they're starting, like they really are aware of the social rules of politeness and talking to people and this and that, and so that's when I think it gets harder for them to really be able to express freely, I don't want to do this, but it's important to let them know that. So when I've had students do, just want to say, when I've had students do like interviews before, like they've done like mini interviews with their classroom, we talk about like watch for like squirming, a lot of like looking away, not making eye contact, or if they're very distracted, or just really don't seem to be engaged, like stop and say, do you want to keep going? We can totally stop. It's perfectly fine if we stop. I'm not going to be upset. You know, it's not a big deal. And then if they say stop, then you stop. Sorry, Teresa.
No, I just had a quick question about what to do with children who aren't really in control of giving consent. Specifically, children with disabilities, when their parents do give consent, but they're not really, they can't say for themselves, well, I don't want to do this anymore, you know, and they can't really filter out those emotions. Like, how do you know?
Yeah. I mean, it's not easy. You have to really feel it out very carefully. But give me a specific example where a parent would say yes, and then a child would be unable to say no.
Maybe a child who's autistic or just like on the far end of the spectrum and just isn't really, I mean, I'm trying to come up with one on the top of my head, but
Yeah, it's not, I know.
yeah.
It's okay.
But just children with disabilities in general, you know, it's a difficult population to kind of approach, especially when you're doing research. And I think it's even harder when you have to think about them being advocates for themselves, and when their parents aren't there, and can their parents just say, oh, it's okay to do research, and you to assume that the children is fine with that.
I mean, in those cases, I would say probably the best thing to do is to be in collaboration with another adult who's responsible for that child, like whether it's the teacher in the classroom or an aide or someone who can tell you, who knows the child well enough to be able to tell you the child seems uncomfortable. It looks like, you know, he or she is tired. Seems like we should probably stop. So because you don't know the child well enough, probably if you're a researcher just coming in, you may not know the child well enough. The parent may be fine with it, but like you said, the child may not feel too comfortable. The best person is probably someone who is used to kind of feeling out what's happening with the child and where he or she is at a particular moment, and may even have some specific ways of communicating with the child that you don't, like, you know, special language that they use or specific words that they've come up with to express certain things or whatever. So that would probably be your best bet, is then to just use that as a resource and not rely on your own. Although relying on your own common sense is, you know, obviously, like, first stop is, you know, you be smart, and if the child just starts running around you and hitting you on the head, is probably not going well. But, you know, outside of those kind of extreme things, just kind of like, what are the resources available to me to be able to understand how this child is communicating? Because I was also just thinking about, and the reason I asked for an example is because I was thinking, well, like, even kids who can't speak often have other tools for communicating, and they can say what they want, or that they want to stop, or, you know, stop, yes, no, like those kind of basic things they can typically communicate, even if it's not using words. But I think you're asking about something more subtle,
Right.
that they may not necessarily even be aware that
Right.
they want to stop or whatever, and that's where I would say rely on someone else who's like an expert in that child, basically. Yeah. That's a really good question. Any other questions? Okay, I'm going to hand out the NYU application for IRB review, and you all will be filling one of these out. You don't have to turn it in to the IRB, because the way that the IRB, the NYU IRB rule goes is that if you are going to be potentially publishing this research, and it's actually research and not just like sort of work for educational purposes, it's not school, you know, it's not classwork, then you don't have to get IRB approval. But if you are, then if you might publish this, then you do need to get IRB approval. and then we'll talk about some interesting ways that people can get around it, can get around some of these things, especially in educational research. Okay, so let's just walk through the whole thing because you're going to be filling it out. So the principal investigator is you, and you check your status, and then you have to say who your faculty sponsor is, and that will be your advisor, your thesis advisor. One of the questions that they ask is, are you requesting exempt status? And that's an important question that's related to some of the stuff that was brought up in your readings, having to do with what kind of research can be claimed as exempt from full review by the full IRB board. Because the way that it works is the IRB at NYU meets a few times a year. The full board meets a few times a year, but they do have people working in the office who can make decisions on, say, studies that are eligible for exempt status, because they meet one of these criteria. So the criteria can be, one, that the research is a study of normal educational practices in commonly accepted educational settings. So this means that you are typically, this line typically refers to teaching or observing teachers, or maybe talking to principals about what they do, or other educators about what work that they do, and you're doing it in schools. If you're doing, the exemption does not apply to research with children when the investigators participate in the activities being observed. So if you are this is specifically like for us, if you are the teacher in this classroom, or you're the student teacher in this classroom, you're taking part of the classroom activities, and the activities are introduced are for the purpose of the project and not part of the curriculum, you are not allowed to do it without, you don't get exempt status. You can get exempt status if you are observing a classroom that you're not working in, and where you're not introducing an activity that isn't a normal part of what's happening. So you could be the teacher who is not who's not introducing anything new. You don't get exempt. You could be the teacher and you are introducing something new. You don't get exempt. You can be not the teacher, but you're introducing something new. You're not exempt. The only way you're exempt is if you are not the teacher or the TA, like you're not sort of a member of that classroom community, and you're not introducing new stuff that would not be part of like the normal day-to-day operations of the classroom. Okay. So I usually get exemption for this one if I'm just like interviewing educators, because I'm just talking to people about what they do, their jobs. I'm not interfering with anything. Exempt status can also be claimed if the research involves the use of educational tests, surveys, or interviews where identifiers are not recorded. In other words, where it's anonymous. Identifiers just means names or some kind of identifying information. So if you're not recording the stuff, or there's neither a risk of harm to the subjects nor the information is sensitive, right? So it's not about people's behavior. But if you're doing research involving surveys and interviews with children, or experiments like computer simulations of decision making, or laboratory test groups of group interactions, or activities involving deceit or manipulation, then you would have to get full IRB consideration. It's only for people who are doing these tests that are completely not identifiable. Like if you just were handing out some questionnaires and almost like an evaluate, like how'd this go? Did you like it? Did you not like it? Doesn't matter who the person's name is. You wouldn't need to get approval or full review for that. You also, if the research involves, you can get exempt if the research is observation of public behavior, where identifiers are not recorded, or there's neither a risk or harm to subjects, or observations of sensitive aspects of the subject's own behavior. So one of the famous scandalous studies that violated this principle is this study called the Tea Room study, and it was a study of a sociological study of men having sex with men. I think it was social anthro. So this researcher would go to public bathrooms where men would solicit other men for sex, and he would observe them, sometimes engage in sexual activity, and observe what was going on. He wasn't collecting personal information, except that he could like people actually he then did write down people's license plates. So he wasn't asking for their names, but he would get their license plates and then like later on find out who they were. And that was obviously like a major violation of ethical conduct. And this is, but it's like people do stupid crap, and then you end up having to make rules like that. You know what I mean? Where you're just like, seriously, who would do that? Thank you very much. Now we all have to have this stupid rule because, like, who thinks of such stupid things? So, if you're in Washington Square Park and you are wanting to observe how kids play with each other on one of the playgrounds, as long as you're not recording who the kids are and you're not observing anything sensitive, like you're not like observing, you know, parents in a diaper changing room and you're like, watch it, you know what I'm saying, or whatever, then that doesn't require full review, and so you would be exempt. You would also be exempt if you're using if you're doing research using educational tests, surveys, interviews, or observation of public behavior. That isn't exempt under the above category, but if the subjects are elected or appointed public officials or candidates for public office. So in other words, these are people who are doing their job, and you're studying them doing their job. That is not the same thing as studying people's private lives, you know, because they're public figures. So their job is already a public, like it's available for public consumption, in other words. That's the point of that. Or if federal statutes require without exception that the confidentiality of the personally identifiable information will be maintained throughout the research and thereafter. So you can also be exempt, number 4, if the research only involves existing collection or study of existing data, documents, records, blah, 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 and the information is private, but identifiers are not recorded by the investigator.
Is that the one where you're talking about the anonymity?
Right.
That one?
Yeah. Excuse me. So, Christine, I'm just going to pick on you only because I know that you're working with Michael. Michael uses secondary data sets. Remember I was talking to you about that there are public data sets that are available, like you can get them online. Sometimes you have to write to somebody to get it, but it's publicly available data sources, and they're not identified. It's not people's names, it's just ID numbers, and it's just like, you know, kids' results on, you know, all different kinds of tests of their aptitude and their abilities and all that kind of stuff. That's called existing data. It's also called secondary data. If you're doing secondary data analysis, you don't typically have to go through full review. And so what some researchers do, NYU is really strict, like I was telling you all about a couple weeks ago. NYU is really strict about educators doing research in their classrooms, and NYU's IRB is more strict than other institutional IRBs about this. So what a lot of like doctoral students have done is they will collect the data, so they'll do their study and then they'll request for IRB to do secondary data analysis. So in other words, they're saying, while I was doing the research, I did not, like I was the instructor and I was doing interviews, and later on I'm going to want to analyze those interviews, but while I was doing it, I didn't tell the students that I was doing a study, and I wasn't, and I didn't get their consent, and then you get the consent after. So like, say if I were to want to do a study of honor students and what projects that they decide to choose to do, but I knew that NYU might have a problem with that. Say all of you were doing theses that were related to like emotional issues, right? So they're like sort of sensitive topics or something like that. And so I felt like the IRB might block me from doing that. I could have all your, and part of my study is like, I'm going to analyze your papers and I'm going to analyze your, you know, journal entries or whatever it is. Then I could collect all those things and I would have them anyway. And then I would say, like, this class is over, the semester ends, we all shut down. And then I contact you and I say, hi, I would like to do a study of honor students. You just participated in honor seminar. May I please have access to your papers? Do you give me permission to analyze your papers? I'm going to de-identify the information, you know, I'm going to separate your name and it'll be confidential, and whatever, you know, I decide to do, I propose it to you, the potential subjects. And then the IRB would have to look at that and say, yeah, that's legitimate, because during the time that the students were her students, their grades, there was no potential for contamination, because even when people say that they're not going to be biased, their argument is, you might say you're not going to be biased, but there's always the possibility that you could be. Whereas if you wait until the class is over, then there is no potential for it to affect your grade whatsoever. It's all a done deal, and you're collecting things that have already been collected. So that's one approach. It's obviously not really practical for you all. What you guys will want to do if you're interested in doing research in a classroom is just not the one where you're student teaching. It can be in the same school where you're student teaching, but just not your classroom. That's the easiest way to get out of it. There are legitimate times when it's warranted to study your own classroom and to do so in a formal way, but most of the time you can do the same thing elsewhere. So it's kind of like weighing the pros and the cons and what's really necessary. And again, remember that research, the idea about research and needing to get IRB approval is that there's an intent to publish. If you're doing research in your own classroom, say you just want to improve your own educational practice, and so you as a teacher, you decide that you want to do a really formal, like a really sort of sophisticated, highly structured, systematic examination of your students and so on, but you never plan to publish it. It's just for your own benefit and maybe the benefit of your teaching community, like the other teachers at your school. You can do something that looks like completely like a study. As long as you don't have the intent to publish, you don't need to get IRB approval. It's only if you somehow want to make what you find public.
Could you then do it in your own classroom if you have no intention of publishing?
Yes. If you have no intention of publishing, it's totally fine to do it in your own classroom.
What if you do have an intention of publishing, but you're not associated with any university? Where would you go?
That's a really good question. So if you were an independent researcher and you wanted to do research on public school kids in New York City, you would have to go through the DOE IRB. Well, you would have to go through that anyway if you're doing a real study where you're trying to interview kids in multiple schools and all that kind of stuff. Yeah, you have to go through the DOE or whatever other, whatever population you're trying to access. Somebody probably has some say over protecting them, and that's who you have to go through. Or you're doing research that's completely anonymous anyway, nobody cares. You're counting how many people walk by in the park, you're counting how many people are wearing red pants, you're observing, you know what I mean? You're doing stuff that's completely anonymous, in which case doesn't really matter or as much. Okay, we won't go about the food studies and those exemptions. Okay, so back to the first page. You have to sign. They will return it to you if there's no signature. Know from experience.
Can I just ask, how many of your students typically